Searching for Answers. We're glad you're on board with us. The program where we take our Bibles and open them up and read them thoughtfully and carefully and ask each other questions, and sometimes we find some answers, but we're glad that you can be in on this. We wish it could be more of a two-way conversation, but nonetheless, it's important that you are participating in this because you are among the most important discussants, even if it's primarily in your own mind. Do not hesitate, however, to get in touch with us through LLBN if you'd like to, and we will try to respond to your queries if we can be helpful. Our discussants this evening include Dr. Bernard Taylor, Old Testament specialist, who really knows his Hebrew, and it's a good thing because this text was originally in Hebrew. He also reads English very well. And Dr. Leo Rancelin, New Testament expert and Associate Dean in the School of Religion here at Loma Linda University. My name is John Jones, La Sierra University. And Dr. Taylor, we are winding up in chapter 5 of Amos. So while our viewers are finding Amos between Joel and Jonah in the Old Testament, we'll invite you to pick up with, well, you can back up and give us a little intro if you like, and then we'll finish up chapter 5.
Yes, and that will be the end of the second section.
And that'll be the end of the second section.
The book of Amos.
Yeah.
So, we were taken up last time with Amos's perspective on the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, this precious time, and he turned it around quite unexpectedly, and it is something that, as we mentioned, will build and come to a head and even some of a crisis in chapter 7. And so everything seemed to be going wrong, and the light, as it were, or the water was spread for us in verse 24. These famous words, justly famous, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And you don't have to go to Israel to understand this, though when you do go there, if you do, you certainly find that it is true. But if you live in Southern California as we do and have been in a drought as long as we have, we understand the importance of rain, and we long for someday soon when it may arrive. And here is this dry season where Amos talks of an endless flowing supply of water, which is not something you can do, it's something that you experience.
Yeah.
And you are caught up in it. And when this happens continually, when others are preferred, when there is care taken of the poor, the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised, the middle class, as Amos was pressing for to be helped by the rich, this is a picture that would come so vividly, so vividly. And if you have a more modern translation, you'll notice with verse 24 that it is the end of a poetic section. And then there follows another verse. They didn't know it as a verse, but we do, at the end of the chapter. And you will notice, again, if you have a modern translation, that this is not in verse, it's in narrative.
Yeah, prose.
I mean, prose.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it's in prose.
Yeah.
And so let me read it. Did you bring to me sacrifices and offering the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You shall take up Sarkuth your king, and Kaiwan your star god, your images, which you made for yourselves. Therefore, I will take you into exile beyond Damascus, says Yahweh, whose name is the God of hosts. And this is a conclusion, a prose conclusion to a poetic section that has gone on for quite a few chapters. Here is an announcement. And it almost sounds as though tickets are going to be handed out to the bus that will take them to Damascus. They have a target in mind. It is announced that it is at least beyond Damascus. How much further they don't yet learn. And later prophets will indicate that it is to Babylon that they are going. But here is the word exile isn't used. It will come to be used later. But there is a definite plan. It is already arranged or being arranged, and you will be part of it. Now, the beginning of verse 25 raises a question, and it seems to be implied that the answer yes is understood, to the effect of, didn't you bring to me sacrifices and offerings the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? And over time, this will come to be understood as, or other passages will speak of it more negative. You didn't bring sacrifices and offerings the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel, did you? And so there are various interpretations of such passages. For my part, I am willing to extend to the prophets the use of hyperbole, of expressing very strongly what is not normally understood to be the case. And we have this sudden two sides. Didn't you do this? In spite of all of that, you shall take your gods, which you have made for yourselves, and you'll go into exile. Into exile beyond Damascus. So around what the British historian Breasted called the Fertile Crescent. If you remember the map on the nightly news, Israel, modern Lebanon, and then it goes up Syria and Assyria around the other side and down the Euphrates to Babylon. And so that's the direction in which you're heading. And if you're going beyond Damascus, you're going quite a bit further before you come to
stop,
something else, somewhere else to stop.
Yeah.
This is frightening. You can hear the gasps of the people. This is audacious. It's one thing to criticize us, but to say we're done for, we're going into exile.
Unthinkable. Unthinkable. And yet, maybe verse 25, maybe part of the point is precisely that it is thinkable because there's a past. You gave me sacrifices and offerings out in the desert for 40 years, didn't you? And yet, I still could turn my back upon you, in a sense. I kept you out there until a new generation could come.
Right, only to survive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So don't think that you've paid your way into a guaranteed acceptance with the divine. That's not how it works. Yeah. This is interesting in verse 26, isn't it? You will take up Sakut, your king, and Kaiwan, your star god, your images, which you made for yourselves with your own hands. Clinging to these icons isn't going to do it either. Just because I turn my back on you doesn't mean you can turn your back on me, in a way, right?
Yes.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. We don't know all of the various divinities whom they honored and worshiped up there in the north. But I think there was a tendency to say, well, after all, Yahweh, if I may use the unspeakable divine name, was first experienced as a kind of a god of a locale, of a certain particular place.
Right.
They thought that way. Now, God has led them to many places and stuck with them so far, but there's still that tendency to associate particular divinities with certain locales. And I suspect that part of the whole dynamic behind this tawdry history, where they're worshiping Kaiwan, whoever this is, this star god, probably is a divinity who was there before. And they've moved in to the new territory. Well, who are the local gods here? How do we get them to multiply our crops and keep the seed time rain and the harvest time latter rain going? How do we do that? And it may have been there was just an almost an automatic tendency to just adopt the local divinities, and because, hey, it worked for the people who lived here before, maybe it'll work for us too.
Right.
Something like that going on, maybe, you think?
More than likely, yeah.
Yeah.
As we've seen with the book of Amos, he's been quite pronounced with social injustice critique of the nation, quite pronounced with empty, meaningless ritual within the nation, kind of the two classic critiques. But another one that, the triad of the prophetic critiques are empty, meaningless ritual, social injustices, and idolatry.
Yeah.
And so here we have
The
one
other
of the
one.
few references in the book of Amos to idolatrous practices. And if we were to dip into Hosea, which is another northern kingdom of Israel prophet, who I think wrote a decade or two after Amos, his emphasis in that book is in a pronounced way on the idolatrous practices that exist within the northern kingdom of Israel. And so if we put these two books together, if you will, Amos and Hosea, the portrait that we get of the northern kingdom of Israel is really tragic. A nation that is in pronounced ways unfaithful to the Mosaic covenant, diseased, if you will, cancerous to such an extent that Yahweh feels drastic measures are necessary. The other thing I want to note about this is that we're still talking about worship here, right?
Yeah.
521 through basically the end of the chapter, he's wrestling with the issue of worship. And it could be that in addition to this empty, meaningless ritual that they're going through, which they think is something that authenticates their lifestyle and perhaps expresses the material prosperity and military security that they're enjoying. We're going to church on Sabbath on a regular basis, so we're good. And this false religion, this deceptive theology, is one in which they've disconnected, right, ethical conduct and ethical behavior with worship. Yeah. And Amos is quite bothered by that. But I think you might want to also connect to worship maybe an incorporation of pagan ideology, pagan practices into Yahwism, if you will. The offering of burnt offerings and sacrifices. So again, a perversion of Israelite religion is also what might be happening here, sketched by Amos. And again, if I were to bring in Hosea, without question, that has taken place.
Yeah, the fancy word is syncretism, which kind of means mooshing together. my translation of that idea. Yeah. So what else? Here it seems to me the tone really, the tone shifts. There's been the cadence of the poetry, as you said so well, Bernard. Yeah, the measured cadence. Now it's broken, and verse 25 makes this rhetorical question all the more powerful. Hey, people, didn't you bring me sacrifices and offerings? Listen, this is me talking. It kind of breaks the measured sort of formality and just really gets their attention in a new way.
If I think of like contemporary relevance of this material for us here today, Amos is, I think, making very clear that our daily life rooted in Christ needs to be characterized by grace, mercy, and love. We can't just disconnect that from worshiping Christ and God on Sabbath and think we're good. He says there has to be coherence, congruity between our worship and our lives, which need to be, as Dr. Taylor has said again and again, justice, a commitment to justice and righteousness on an ongoing, regular basis.
I'm thinking about chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I may have mentioned it at the time, but I think it might be helpful for us to reconsider. Remember, for 3 transgressions of, fill in the blank, even for 4, lo archivenu, I will not cause it to return. And when I was teaching this here at Loma Linda to students who were at the graduate level, I would give them a sheet of paper with those major sections, the repetitive portions. Therefore, because, and the reasons are, and therefore. And they were to prepare for class by filling this out relative to a current situation of which they were aware of. It may be Me Too. This was before then, but it could be Me Too. It could be treatment of children and all of the social concerns of the time. And I continually wonder when I come back to Amos is, what would Amos see today where we live, wherever we may be in terms of listeners and those us here who are presenting? How would Amos characterize it? We know that he doesn't veneer it. He gives it forthrightly, but kindly, and he really cares, and he wants them for their own interest and concern, because he knows that otherwise the future is not going to be bright at all. It's darkness and not light, evil and not good. And so this brought home to me each time I taught, and they were free. And then the next week they would present it. They didn't have to, but most by now were happy to with the time they'd put in it. And they put, I think, more into any other single assignment than they, less than they put into this one. And it was very revealing, and that I think is the prophetic spirit, and that is what leads us to be able to relate to the prophets, because they related to their time just as we need to see our time personally and collectively, that we might know how God sees us, and then we're open to the remedies that Amos and other prophets offer.
If I could take a stab at his question in terms of a contemporary relevance, I think he does speak in powerful ways to the contemporary scene. And you, I think, alluded to in a previous program the potential conflict between priest and prophet.
I don't mean to overstate that, but
it really they underscore that again and again, that Amos does not have a whole lot of nice things to say about the shrines of Bethel and Gilgal, and the priests who oversee those. And I agreed with what you'd said earlier. I don't think there actually was a specific critique against priests. He's just highlighting this empty, meaningless ritual. But get back to your question, Dr. Taylor, I think what Amos tells us today is pastors, theologians, who perhaps are a little too close to people of influence, of power. This here was the royal house and the wealthy merchants who had lost sight of God's will. be careful that you don't get too aligned with them and forget the cardinal tenets of the Christian faith and of the gospel, and I would argue the Sermon on the Mount. Because it's very easy to enjoy the privileges that wealth and power bring to you as pastors and theologians. And you too could end up forgetting the will of God. I think Amos would say that in powerful ways to us today, would he not?
So what we're suggesting, and both of you have very clearly and helpfully done so, is that Amos helps us look in the mirror. It's hard to do that. But when he says, hey, for 3 transgressions, 4, now look in the mirror. Are there 3? Can you think of 4? You know, with regard to our lives, and I think, Bernard, you were right when you said both singly and corporately, as a community as a whole. This calling to account, I think we need it today. If we didn't have Amos, it would be easier for us to tiptoe around things as they were doing, you know? And Amos is cutting through the self-congratulation and the selfishness, and he gives us a model by which we can hold up the same mirror to ourselves, finally.
And remember, while Amos is a prophet,
Yeah.
he is also able to say, and this is a forward reference, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. And in the traditional sense, he was right. To put it in our terms then, Amos, though called of God, was a lay prophet, a lay preacher. And by now, I hope you can see that this is the message that is here is akin to what we call preaching. It's to the time and the place.
And the place.
It's not way off in the future. It's close enough to name where they're going, or the first, a major waymark along the way, though it will go beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else?
And on this very point, just to underscore a point that's right in the book itself, Amaziah is the priest of Bethel. And who is he sympathetic towards? Who is he beholden to? But King Jeroboam II. He makes that very clear. And here you have a priest losing sight of the will of God. And for us today as pastors and theologians, I think another warning, if you will, that we too not lose sight of the will of God.
And keep in mind that Jeroboam II, as you say, this is years later after Jeroboam I, the successors to Solomon, Rehoboam in the south and Jeroboam in the north. We have gone into a dip, and unexpectedly, in terms of the events at the time, as Syria was otherwise occupied, and we are almost back to the prosperity and the control of land from the best of David and Solomon. This is remarkable. It's in this context of prosperity where everybody is grabbing whatever they can because of all of the controls they have on trade. They have the north and south trade route go through their territory. So things are looking great. And Amos comes along. Sort of like God of our fathers known of old, that hymn written at the time of, Victoria's long reign. And everybody wondered why the poet laureate was silent. And then he penned this piece that just was so powerful. And that's what Amos did. There wasn't music to go with it, but the words were there and calling hard.
You've both mentioned that this is a turning point in the overall collection of messages. Here at the end of chapter 5, we close off what is essentially the second section of Amos. And so it's a kind of a place where we turn the page now, isn't it? You know? Any aspect of that before we move on?
Well, I ask myself, How is it possible for the northern kingdom of Israel to have arrived in this kind of condition? And as I reflect and think about the book, trying to diagnose the problem, I'm tempted to go back to Exodus 19, in which when the covenant was given.
Yeah.
And it just seems to me the northern kingdom of Israel lost sight of the covenant that Yahweh made with them there at Mount Sinai. This is Exodus 19, verses 4 and following. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if, and that's the key word there, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation, if you obey.
And the people in verse 8 reply,
Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do.
we're
Covenant
on.
relationship.
Yep, we're
but
on.
it's a conditional covenant predicated on faithful obedience to the Torah. It seems to me they lost sight of that.
Yeah,
and their election, they felt, was unconditional.
Yeah.
And how they acted toward one another didn't really matter because we were God's elect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, as we noted last time, that Amos brings us full circle to the creation and the uncreation here in chapter 5. It's been an interesting journey, and here are these people who are a long way removed from all of those events of the past. And if you notice carefully, like here in Amos, I'm the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And when you follow in the books of Kings, the books of Kings, they serve God, they turn away from him, and there's this cycling that they keep going through. And it's so repetitive, it's so monotonous, and God is so loving and so caring. But as every parent knows, sometimes there are moments when you have to do things that you would rather not have to do, but not doing them is too bad. And so you do it. You discipline, you guide, and you care. And God found Amos.
Yeah.
Who was, quote, just a shepherd. And then we talk of the master shepherd.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
So there's still a shepherding story behind all of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, and yet there's still that hope. The door is not absolutely closed yet, is it? There is a peril to privilege, to being the chosen people, but at the same time, the opportunity is there. These are the lessons from ancient time for us still today, as we continue working our way through Amos and searching for answers.